Hello, and welcome back to the Live Label Free podcast. I'm your host, Livia Sarah, an autism and eating disorder recovery coach and author that's on a mission to help neurodivergent individuals and their loved ones turn their mess into their message. This is part 2 of my series on neurodivergence and binge eating, and today we'll be discussing the sensory component of why autistic and ADHD people may overeat or binge eat, as well as how this connects to the nervous system. Before diving in, I want to ask you a super quick favor. If you have learned anything from listening to this podcast, can you please leave a positive rating and review for the Live Label Free podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or if you want to show even more support on both platforms? I absolutely love bringing free value to your ears each week, and leaving a rating and review for the podcast is a completely free, quick, and easy way to show your support. Plus, it helps other people find the show so that together we can break the stigmas around neurodivergence and eating disorders so that everyone can get the help they deserve. I so appreciate your time, and now let's dive into today's episode.
Gotta put one foot in front of the other, and you'll be around the corner soon.
Welcome to the Live Label Free podcast, where we talk about autism, ADHD, eating disorders, existentialism, and everything in between. I'm your host, Livia Sarah. Now let's get into it. In part 1 of this series, we touched on interoception, which is the sense responsible for helping us understand our inner cues, such as hunger, fullness, thirst, and temperature. But of course, there are many more senses which all originate in the nervous system. Before we dive into how the neurodivergent sensory experience can impact binge eating, it's helpful to have a basic understanding of what the nervous system is and how it works. The nervous system is a complex network that controls and coordinates all the activities of the body. It is composed of 2 main parts: the central nervous system, CNS, which includes the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, PNS, which consists of nerves that branch out from the spinal cord and extend to all parts of the body. The nervous system is responsible for processing sensory information, regulating bodily functions, and enabling us to think, move, and interact with our environment. Neurodivergent individuals often experience nervous system dysregulation, which refers to a condition that occurs when the nervous system is overwhelmed and out of balance. In optimal circumstances, humans have the ability to move flexibly between the different branches of the nervous system, including the sympathetic nervous system, SNS, which triggers the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system, PNS, which promotes rest and digest. However, being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world can cause us to live in a constant state of fight or flight mode. This overactivation of your sympathetic nervous system can lead to chronic anxiety, fatigue, mood swings, difficulty concentrating, sleep disturbances, digestive issues, and pretty much all the other symptoms neurodivergent people have to deal with on the daily. It's no secret that food also has a huge impact on our nervous system. Not only is food restriction a literal threat to your survival, which can activate fight or flight mode and then ultimately result in extreme hunger or binging as the body attempts to bring you back to safety, but the eating experience itself is probably one of the most sensory-rich experiences in existence. For those with restrictive eating disorders, the sensory input that accompanies eating, whether this be tastes, textures, smells, but also the internal input like feelings of fullness and the way food contributes to changes in body temperature, food avoidance can be an effective strategy to reduce sensory input and regulate oneself. Of course, food restriction, whether this be as quote-unquote short as not eating the whole day due to interoceptive difficulties, or as long as years or even decades of a restrictive eating disorder such as anorexia, orthorexia, ARFID, and all the other behaviors that fall on what I've coined as the adaptive eating spectrum, the body's main priority is survival. And by the way, if you want to learn more about this adaptive eating spectrum I speak of, be sure to get on the waitlist for my upcoming program, Autistically ED-Free Academy, by visiting the link livelabelfree.com/group. Now, coming back to the main episode, if you're in energy deficit, the body is going to do everything it can to bring you back into energy balance. This may result in binging later in the day if you haven't eaten enough, or in the case of prolonged restriction, it may be more appropriate to term your overeating behaviors as extreme hunger, which I fully explain in my book, How to Beat Extreme Hunger, which you can now grab your very own copy of at livelabelfree.com/extreme hunger book. On the other end of the spectrum are the sensory seekers, those of us who are constantly seeking stimulation and who may use food and eating as a form of stimming or grounding. And here's where my personal story shifts a bit. So like I showed in part 1 of this Autism and Binge eating series, I had a huge appetite as a kid. Honestly, I still do. I could eat so much and wouldn't know I was full until I was so stuffed and nauseous that all I could do was feel miserable. And while I do remember knowing that I didn't quite understand why or how my body did this, I literally thought that everyone felt this way. I thought that everyone ate until they were so full that they felt like they were going to explode. It wasn't until 5th grade health class, and I was around 11 years old at the time, when I started learning about health and nutrition and food and BMI and pretty much all the information that I now know is steeped in diet culture, that I first started questioning my food choices. If you've read my book, Rainbow Girl, you know my autistic mind took all of the health recommendations so literally, and I completely latched onto this identity of being a quote-unquote perfect healthy eater. Not only could this new identity almost be seen as an attempted solution to an unconscious existential crisis I was going through due to feeling misunderstood and different, but it was also a form of masking. I believed that if I could conform to diet culture and adhere to the rules I set for myself around food and exercise, that I could finally feel a sense that I, quote-unquote, fit in to this world in which I felt so alienated. Well, it's pretty obvious how that turned out for me, and if you're listening to this, I can only assume that you too have not gotten the results you were expecting a diet or an eating disorder to give you. And that's because your nervous system knows danger when it sees it, or better said, experiences it, and it will do everything it can to help you survive during threatening times. During my restrictive eating disorder, this looked like being very sensory avoidant. I always ate the same things at the same times because I was completely trapped in this fight or flight state that couldn't cope with anything new or different. Because new and different meant unpredictable, which my body perceived as unsafe. When I decided to recover, however, my nervous system was like, hey, she's eating, she's resting, I guess we're not in danger after all. And so I became much more of a sensory seeker around food. Not only did increased sensory input from food provide me with a sense of pleasure I had deprived myself of for nearly 7 years, but it also soothed me. Eating a lot of highly palatable food allowed me to feel safe and grounded. If you have a history of restriction and thus your nervous system has a history of knowing trauma, the fact that food is grounding and soothing and acts as a way to regulate your nervous system makes complete biological sense. Why? Because it proves you are safe. Because the neurotypical world we live in is quite literally a threat to the survival of autistic people, we tend to have a heightened need for external signs of safety. I believe this deep need for confirmation is at the root of our need for predictability and routines and structure and sameness and all the classic autistic traits we've come to know and love. At the same time, they can also be our Achilles heel in the sense that we may constantly rely on external validation and constant input of external safety cues to stay grounded and to keep our nervous system regulated. I believe this is where sensory-seeking tendencies of autistic people may flip into binge eating. Not only can the consumption of highly palatable foods be considered a form of stimming, which is self-stimulatory behavior, or in other words, self-regulatory behavior, but it's also a very effective way to procrastinate the tasks that our brain is perceiving as threatening and to temporarily escape from this reality we probably feel trapped in. For me personally, when I'm really stressed, and this is usually the case when I'm working on a big project for Live Label Free, I'm in the middle of a big life transition, or I just have way too much on my plate, no pun intended, I often find myself doing the opposite of what I did during my anorexia. Instead of restricting and over-exercising as a way to escape my reality, I will go into the kitchen and I will turn to food. And to be honest, it works every time, until I get to the point where I feel sick and I'm full, and like a broken record, I will repeatedly ask myself, why did you just do that? Sound familiar? Now, it's worth stressing that, quote-unquote, emotional eating isn't always a bad thing. I sincerely believe and honestly hope that anyone who has a healthy relationship with food eats purely for comfort at least a few times a day. Like I just mentioned, I definitely do. Yes, I may feel a bit sick and nauseous afterwards, and this is probably due to the fact that I have a hard time sensing fullness and always have, but the difference between once in a while eating for comfort and binge eating disorder is that with true binge eating disorder, food becomes your only method of self-regulation. And when we're putting all our eggs in one basket like that, well, there's a reason it's an expression not to do that. The same thing goes for procrastination. In the eating disorder recovery and anti-diet spaces, there's this common mandate that food isn't a reward. And while I definitely agree that nourishment isn't something that one must earn or only be deserving of after you've moved your body or eaten quote-unquote clean all week or anything silly like that, using food as a reward can be a really effective way to get tasks done for us autistic ADHDers. If I need to get my daily writing goal in or have a lot of admin tasks that I really don't feel like doing, it does help to tell myself, okay, Livia, if you just focus for the next hour, you get to eat some apple pie. Well, with that pie waiting for me, you bet my ass is gonna get her words in. Now, does this mean I only allow myself to eat apple pie if I accomplish a task beforehand? No, that's what I've healed my relationship with food for. My point is that there's a lot of nuance between what diet culture tells us is good versus what the diet culture rebels tell us is good. In the end, what works for you is good, and unfortunately, there's no how-to on how to live your life. What there is, thankfully, is people on the internet sharing their lived experience and wisdom and insight, so I truly hope you're getting a lot out of these episodes. If you are, and if you haven't already, can you please leave a rating and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or if you're listening on YouTube, leave a lovely comment. Like I said at the top of this episode, it helps more people to find this podcast so everyone can improve their understanding of the connection between autism and binge eating and find their unique version of food freedom. To conclude this second part of my series on neurodivergence and binge eating, using food as an escape can be a very effective way to transcend into an alternate reality that doesn't contain the demands of work or family or email or anything else that overwhelms us in this world not built for the neurodivergent alien. It temporarily numbs us from our constant state of fight or flight mode, acting as a safety blanket and helping us feel grounded. And because it can be such an effective, albeit temporary, method to stim, which is always done to self-regulate, it's such a convenient way to procrastinate the demands that we don't want to do in that moment. In the next episode, we're going to be talking about aspects of binge eating that are closely tied to this procrastination, and those aspects are transitions and autistic inertia. If you're listening on YouTube, be sure to like this video and subscribe wherever you're listening, and wherever you are, I'll talk to you soon in part 3 of this neurodivergent binge eating series. Bye-bye for now.
Baby, just one foot in front of the other, and you'll see